The rain was coming down in sheets when the Greyhound bus hydroplaned. I remember the driver's eyes in the rearview mirror, wide with panic, as the vehicle fishtailed across the wet highway. My hands instinctively gripped the edge of my seat, the paperback novel I'd been reading sliding across the floor. The bus jerked violently to the right, and then everything became a blur of motion, screams, and the deafening sound of metal against guardrail. I've always prided myself on staying calm in a crisis. 40 years of marriage to Warren and raising 2 headstrong children had taught me patience and resilience. But in that moment, as the bus tipped onto its side and I was thrown against the window, my composure shattered along with the glass. When I regained consciousness, I was lying on damp pavement, the rain still falling on my face. Emergency lights pulsed red and blue against the darkening sky. A paramedic was leaning over me, asking questions I couldn't quite process. My head throbbed, and a sharp pain radiated from my left shoulder down to my wrist. Later, I would learn that I had a concussion, a dislocated shoulder, and 3 broken ribs. But in that moment, my primary thought was getting home to Warren. We'd had a fight before I left to visit Haley in Colorado, something trivial about the garden renovations I'd been planning. It seemed so unimportant now. "Ma'am, can you tell me your name?" the paramedic asked, his voice cutting through my disoriented thoughts. "Marlene Westbrook," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "But everyone calls me Marley." "Okay, Marley, you've been in an accident. We're going to take you to the hospital now." The next 12 hours passed in a haze of examinations, x-rays, and painkillers. I tried calling Warren several times, but he didn't pick up. That wasn't like him, but I reasoned he might be working late or had the phone on silent. He'd been doing that more often lately, claiming he needed to focus on a major bridge project. The nurses were kind but overworked, and I felt like just another elderly patient they needed to process through the system. At 63, I didn't consider myself elderly, but the pitying looks from the young staff suggested otherwise. By the next morning, I had been cleared to leave, though the doctor advised against traveling alone. I ignored this advice. All I wanted was to be in my own home, in my own bed, with Warren bringing me tea, the way he had during my bout with pneumonia 3 winters ago. The hospital was about 40 miles from our house in Ridgefield, Connecticut, and I took a taxi, wincing at every bump in the road that jostled my injuries. Our house, the one we'd bought 30 years ago when Warren's career as an engineer was just taking off, sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, partially hidden by the maple trees I'd planted when we first moved in. They were full-grown now, their leaves beginning to turn amber and crimson with the early October chill. As the taxi pulled away, I stood at the bottom of our driveway, overnight bag clutched awkwardly in my good hand, feeling a strange sense of foreboding. Something was different. The garden I'd meticulously maintained was slightly overgrown, as expected after my week-long absence, but there were other changes. Warren's classic Mustang wasn't in the driveway, though it was Saturday morning, and he rarely went anywhere on weekends without it. And there was a sleek silver Audi I didn't recognize parked where I usually left my Subaru, which was still in the long-term parking at the bus station. With each painful step up the driveway, my uneasiness grew. When I reached the front door and tried my key, it didn't fit. I stared at the lock in confusion, then tried again, thinking my concussion might be affecting my coordination. The key wouldn't turn. I rang the doorbell, leaning heavily against the porch railing as waves of pain and exhaustion washed over me. I heard movement inside, and relief flooded through me. Warren was home. He could help me upstairs, and I could finally rest. But when the door opened, the person standing there wasn't my husband of 40 years. It was a young woman with long blonde hair and the kind of lithe, yoga-toned body I'd stopped having around the time Curtis was born. She wore one of Warren's old MIT sweatshirts and nothing else that I could see, her tanned legs bare against the dark fabric. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice pleasant but wary. I stared at her, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. I live here," I finally managed to say. "Who are you?" The woman's expression shifted from wariness to pity, a look I was becoming far too familiar with. "You must be Marlene," she said. "Warren mentioned you might stop by to collect your things." Before I could respond, I heard Warren's voice from inside the house. "Tiff? Who's at the door?" And then he appeared behind her, his tall frame familiar, yet somehow changed. He had trimmed his beard and was wearing the expensive watch I'd given him for our anniversary 2 months ago, the one he'd said was too flashy for his taste. "Warren," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "What's going on?" "I was in an accident. The bus crashed on the way back from Haley's, and I've been trying to call you." For a moment, I saw something like concern flash across his face, but it quickly hardened into something cold and distant. "Are you all right?" he asked. But the question felt perfunctory, without the urgency you'd expect from a husband of 40 years. "No, I'm not all right," I said, gesturing to the sling supporting my injured arm and the bruises visible on my face. "I need to come in. I don't understand what's happening here." Warren stepped forward, partially blocking the doorway. "Marley, we talked about this. Well, not about you getting hurt, and I'm sorry about that, but about us. Things haven't been right for a long time." "What are you talking about?" "We had a fight about the garden before I left, that's all." I felt dizzy, and not just from the concussion. "It wasn't just the garden," Warren said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he used when explaining complex engineering concepts to laypeople. "It's been everything. You're always gone, always wrapped up in your plants and gardens and projects. You're never really here, Marley, haven't been for years." I stared at him in disbelief. Yes, I'd been busy with my landscaping business before retiring, and yes, I still took on occasional design projects because I loved the work. But I'd also been the one who managed our home, raised our children, hosted dinner parties for his colleagues, and rearranged my schedule countless times to accommodate his career. "Warren, please," I said, taking a step forward. "I don't know what's going on, but I'm hurt and tired, and I just want to come inside my home." His expression hardened further. "This isn't your home anymore, Marley. I had the locks changed last week. I filed for divorce. My lawyer will be contacting you." The words hit me like a physical blow. I swayed on my feet, and for a moment, I thought I might faint right there on the porch. The young woman, Tiffany he'd called her, had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Warren, maybe she should come in for a minute," she murmured, placing a hand on his arm. "She looks really pale." But Warren shook his head. "I think it's better if we make a clean break," he said firmly. "There's a hotel down on Main Street, Marley. Why don't you go there and get some rest? We can talk about arrangements later." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. 40 years of marriage, and he was treating me like an unwanted solicitor at the door. "You can't just throw me out," I said, my shock giving way to anger. "This is my house too. My name is on the deed. Like I said, my lawyer will be in touch. You'll get what's fair, but this arrangement isn't working for me anymore." He started to close the door. In desperation, I placed my good hand against it. "Warren, please, we can talk about this. Whatever's wrong, we can fix it. We've been together for 40 years. For a moment, something like regret passed across his face. Then his expression hardened again. "And they haven't been good years, Marley. Not for a long time. I found something better. Something real. I'm sorry." And with that, he gently but firmly pushed the door closed, leaving me standing on the porch of what had been my home just a week ago, my overnight bag at my feet and the rain beginning to fall once more. I don't know how long I stood there, stunned and swaying slightly, before my survival instincts kicked in. The pain in my shoulder and ribs was becoming unbearable, and I knew I needed to find shelter and regroup. Somehow, I made it down the driveway and began walking toward the center of town, each step sending jolts of pain through my injured body. Ridgefield wasn't a large town, but in my condition, the mile to Main Street felt like a marathon. By the time I reached the Ridgefield Inn, a small hotel that catered mostly to tourists visiting the historic district, I was soaked through and shivering uncontrollably. The young man at the reception desk took one look at me and immediately called for help. "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need an ambulance?" I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak without breaking down completely. Somehow I managed to check in, using the emergency credit card I kept in my wallet. The room was small but clean, with a view of the town square. I peeled off my wet clothes, took the pain medication the hospital had provided, and collapsed onto the bed. Only then did I allow myself to cry. Great racking sobs that aggravated my broken ribs but couldn't be contained. Warren wanted a divorce. Warren had another woman. Warren had changed the locks on our home. None of it seemed real, yet the pain in my body confirmed that I wasn't having a nightmare. Somehow, in the space of 24 hours, I'd lost everything. My health, my home, my husband, my sense of security. I must have fallen into an exhausted sleep because the next thing I knew, the room was dark and someone was knocking at the door. For a disoriented moment, I thought I was back home, and Warren was bringing me tea. Then reality crashed back, and I remembered where I was and why. Painfully, I made my way to the door, checking through the peephole before opening it. Standing in the hallway was Josephine Sandoval, my best friend of 20 years and owner of Bloom, the garden supply shop where I'd spent countless hours selecting plants for my designs. "Joe," I said, opening the door. "How did you find me?" "Small town," she said, stepping inside and setting down several bags. "Billy at the front desk called me. Said you looked like you'd been through hell and he was worried. What happened, Marley? Were you in an accident?" I nodded, then found myself telling her everything. The bus crash, the hospital, and the devastating scene at what used to be my home. Jo listened without interrupting, her face growing increasingly outraged. "That bastard," she finally said when I'd finished. "After 40 years, this is how he treats you? And with some yoga bimbo half his age? When you're injured, no less?" Despite everything, I felt a need to be fair. "I don't know how long it's been going on. He said things haven't been good between us for a long time. But I didn't know. I thought we were okay," Jo snorted. "Men, they rewrite history to justify their midlife crises. You were more than okay. You built that man's whole life for him, Marley. You raised his kids. You entertained his colleagues. You managed that house while running your own business. And now he thinks he can just throw you away?" Put that way, it did seem particularly cruel. And yet, there must have been signs I'd missed. Had Warren really been unhappy all these years? Had I been so wrapped up in my gardens and designs that I'd failed to notice my marriage withering? "I don't know what to do, Jo," I admitted, the words catching in my throat. "I have no home, almost no money of my own. The business account is joint with Warren, and most of our savings are tied up in investments he manages." "First things first," Jo said firmly. "You're hurt and need to rest. I brought you some clothes, toiletries, and food. Tomorrow, we'll start figuring out the rest. You can stay with me until you're back on your feet." I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition. It's what friends do. She began unpacking the bags, setting out containers of soup, fresh clothes, and basic necessities. "And once you're feeling better, we're going to get you the best divorce lawyer in Connecticut. If Warren thinks he can discard you like yesterday's newspaper after 40 years, he's got another thing coming." As Jo continued organizing the room, making it more hospitable, I felt something shift inside me. The devastating shock was still there, but alongside it, a tiny spark of something else was beginning to glow. Determination, perhaps, or the first embers of anger replacing hurt. For 40 years, I'd been Marlene Hargrove, Warren's wife, Haley and Curtis's mother. I'd defined myself largely through those relationships and through my work creating beauty in other people's spaces. Now, at 63, I was being forced to redefine everything. Who was Marlene Westbrook without Warren? What did she want? What was she capable of? I didn't have answers yet, but as I watched Jo's efficient movements, listened to her outrage on my behalf, I realized I wasn't entirely alone. And maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward through this devastation, one step at a time. "Thank you," I said quietly, as Jo finished setting out the food. She looked at me, her expression softening. "You'd do the same for me. Now eat something, take your meds, and get some rest. Tomorrow's another day, and we've got work to do." As I sipped the soup Jo had brought, I gazed out at the darkened town square, the place I'd called home for 3 decades. Nothing looked the same anymore, not even the familiar storefronts and streets. But I was still here, bruised and broken in more ways than one, but still breathing, still thinking, still capable of action. Warren might have closed the door on our life together, but perhaps, in doing so, he'd opened another door I hadn't even known existed, one that led not to the past and all I'd lost, but to a future I'd never imagined for myself. The thought was terrifying, but as I drifted back to sleep, that small spark of determination continued to glow, a a single point of light in the darkness that had engulfed my life. Morning came with a harsh clarity that the fog of shock had previously obscured. I woke in the unfamiliar hotel room, my body stiff and aching from the bus accident injuries. For a few blissful seconds, I existed in the limbo between sleep and full awareness. Then reality crashed back. The accident, Warren, the blonde woman in our doorway, the locked door that had once welcomed me home. Joe arrived at 9 with coffee and a determined expression that I recognized from the days when she'd first opened her store against everyone's advice. "We have appointments," she announced, setting a paper cup on the bedside table. "First with Dr. Patel to check your injuries, then with Regina Kwan." "Who's Regina Kwan?" I asked, struggling to sit up with one functioning arm. "The best divorce attorney in Fairfield County. She specializes in cases where husbands think they can discard decades of marriage on a whim." Joe's efficiency was both comforting and overwhelming. While I was still processing the seismic shift in my life, she was already planning counterattacks. The visit to Dr. Patel was mercifully brief. She examined my injuries with gentle competence, prescribed stronger pain medication, and advised at least 2 weeks of rest before attempting any strenuous activity. Throughout the examination, I found myself studying her, a woman perhaps 15 years my junior, confident in her expertise, with photos of what appeared to be her children on her desk, but no wedding ring. I wondered about her story, whether she'd chosen independence or had it thrust upon her as I had. "The physical injuries will heal relatively quickly," Dr. Patel said as she finished writing prescriptions. "The emotional trauma may take longer. I'm recommending a therapist who specializes in both post-accident trauma and major life transitions." I accepted the card she handed me, though I couldn't imagine discussing my humiliation with a stranger. In my generation, we handled our problems privately, not by paying someone to listen to them. Still, I thanked her and tucked the card into my purse. Regina Kwan's office occupied the top floor of one of Ridgefield's few modern buildings. Unlike the cozy New England charm of most businesses in town, her space was sleek and minimalist, with views overlooking the historic district. The woman herself matched her surroundings, sharp, elegant, and exuding an aura of controlled power that made me simultaneously intimidated and grateful she was on my side. "Mrs. Westbrook," she said, shaking my hand carefully to avoid jostling my injured arm. "I'm sorry for the circumstances that brought you here. Ms. Sandoval has briefed me on your situation, but I'd like to hear it from you." For the second time in 24 hours, I recounted the devastating events, this time with less emotion and more detail. Regina listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a sleek tablet. When I finished, she set the tablet aside and looked at me directly. "What your husband has done is not only cruel, but potentially illegal," she said. "Connecticut is an equitable distribution state. That means marital property must be divided fairly in a divorce. By changing the locks and attempting to deny you access to your home and possessions, Mr. Hargrove has already made a serious misstep. He said his lawyer would be in touch about arrangements," I offered. Regina's smile was thin and predatory. "I'm sure they will, but we won't be waiting for that. Today, we're going to file emergency motions for temporary spousal support and exclusive possession of the marital home." "You mean I could go back home?" The thought was both comforting and unsettling. Could I really return to the house where another woman had taken my place? "It's your legal residence, Mrs. Westbrook. You have every right to be there. Mr. Hargrove cannot simply decide unilaterally that you no longer have a claim to your home of 30 years. She tapped something on her tablet. "Now let's discuss finances. I understand from Ms. Sandoval that your husband has handled most financial matters throughout your marriage?" I nodded, feeling a flush of embarrassment. It seemed foolish now, but Warren had always managed our investments, taxes, and major financial decisions. I'd handled the household accounts and my business finances, but the bigger picture had been his domain. "That's not uncommon for women of your generation," Regina said, her tone neutral rather than judgmental. "But it does mean we need to act quickly to prevent any potential hiding or movement of assets. I'll need your authorization to issue subpoenas for all financial records." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of technical discussions about marital property, retirement accounts, and legal strategies. By the time we finished, My head was spinning with information, and my body was screaming for rest and pain medication. But beneath the exhaustion, I felt something I hadn't expected, a glimmer of hope that I might not be left destitute after all. "One last thing, Mrs. Westbrook," Regina said, as Joe helped me to my feet. "I'd like you to document everything about your marriage, your contributions, both financial and non-financial, your role in supporting your husband's career, raising your children, maintaining your home, your sacrifices and compromises. This isn't just about dividing assets, it's about recognizing the value of what you've invested in this marriage." As we left the office, I pondered her words. What had I invested? 40 years of my life, certainly, but also countless small sacrifices, the landscaping business I'd kept deliberately small so I could be available for family needs, the moves I'd made to accommodate Warren's career, the dinners, parties, and events I'd hosted to help him network with colleagues and clients. "You're quiet," Joe observed as she drove us back to her house, a charming colonial on the other side of town from the home I'd shared with Warren. "Just thinking about what Regina said, about documenting my contributions to the marriage. I've been trying to remember when things started to change between Warren and me." Joe snorted. "Don't do that to yourself, Marley. Don't look for ways this might be your fault. Warren made his choices." "I know, but—" I trailed off, staring out the window at the familiar streets of Ridgefield. "We used to be happy. At least I thought we were. How did I miss the signs that he was so unhappy he'd throw away 40 years? Joe was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "Men like Warren, they hit a certain age and panic. They look in the mirror and see the gray hair, the wrinkles, and they think a younger woman will somehow make them young again. It's not about you, Marley. It's about his fear of mortality." Perhaps she was right, but it didn't diminish the hurt or the nagging sense that I should have noticed something. Warren and I had grown more distant in recent years. It was true. We'd fallen into comfortable routines, parallel lives that intersected at meals and social events, but rarely connected on a deeper level. Still, I'd attributed that to the natural evolution of a long marriage, not a sign of impending collapse. Joe's guest room was small but comfortable, with a window overlooking her backyard garden, a space I'd helped design years ago when she'd first bought the house after her divorce. There was a certain irony in finding myself in the same position she had been in 15 years earlier, though her husband had at least had the decency to discuss their problems before leaving. "Make yourself at home," Joe said, setting my overnight bag on the bed. "I've cleared some space in the closet and dresser. The bathroom's stocked with everything you should need, but let me know if there's anything else." I sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the simple kindness of having a place to stay. "Joe, I don't know how to thank you." She waved away my words. "You'd do the same for me. Actually, you did do the same for me, remember? When Thomas left, you were the one who showed up with wine and chocolate and listened to me rant for hours." I smiled faintly at the memory. Joe's divorce had been bitter, but straightforward compared to what I was facing. Thomas hadn't tried to deny her access to their home or assets, and they hadn't accumulated the complex financial entanglements that came with 40 years of marriage. "Rest now," Joe said, heading for the door. "I need to open the shop for a few hours, but I'll be back by dinner time. Call if you need anything." Alone in the quiet room, I carefully removed my sling and outer clothes and eased onto the bed. The pain medication was making me drowsy, and I welcomed the temporary escape of sleep. But as I drifted off, my thoughts turned to my children. By now, Warren would surely have contacted them with his version of events. What had he told them? Did they know I'd been injured? That their father had locked me out of my own home? I needed to call them, but the thought of explaining everything was overwhelming. Haley had always been closer to Warren, sharing his analytical mind and interest in structural design. She'd followed him into engineering, though she'd focused on environmental aspects rather than civil projects. Curtis, our youngest, was more creative like me, but had always sought his father's approval. How would they react to the sudden dissolution of their parents' marriage? Sleep claimed me before I could formulate a plan, and when I woke, the light had changed, casting long afternoon shadows across the room. My phone was buzzing on the nightstand, Curtis calling. With a deep breath, I answered. His voice came through immediately, concerned and confused. "Mom, are you okay? Dad called and said you two were separating, but then Joe called and said you were in an accident." What's going on? I summarized the bus crash and my injuries, trying to keep my voice steady as I moved on to what had happened at the house. Curtis listened in stunned silence. Dad changed the locks? And he has some woman living there already? I don't even know what to say. His voice had the quality it got when he was pacing, something he'd done since childhood when upset. It was a shock to me too, I said, aiming for dignified rather than pitiful. I've engaged a lawyer, and we're filing motions tomorrow regarding the house and finances. Where are you staying? Do you need anything? I can drive up from New York this weekend. The genuine concern in his voice brought tears to my eyes. I'm staying with Joe for now. And yes, I'd love to see you this weekend, but don't feel you have to come if you're busy. Pride made me add the last part, though I desperately wanted to see my son, to have someone from my family acknowledge the devastating turn my life had taken. I'll be there Saturday morning, he said firmly. Have you talked to Haley? I hesitated. Not yet. I was going to call her after we spoke. Curtis was quiet for a moment. Mom, you should know. Haley and Dad have been talking a lot lately. I think she might have known about Tiffany before you did. The revelation shouldn't have hurt as much as it did. Haley and Warren had always been close, sharing long phone calls about engineering projects and professional challenges. That she might have known about his affair, might have kept that secret from me. Felt like a second betrayal. I'll still call her, I said, not knowing what else to add. After promising again to visit on Saturday, Curtis ended the call. I sat for a long time staring at the phone, trying to gather the courage to call my daughter. Finally, I dialed her number, but it went straight to voicemail. Instead of leaving a message, I sent a text. Haley, I'd like to talk. Please call when you can. The response came almost immediately. In meetings all day. Dad told me what's happening. Will call tomorrow. Terse and non-committal. I couldn't tell from those few words where her sympathies lay, but Curtis's warning echoed in my mind. Had my daughter really known her father was planning to leave me? Had she approved of his relationship with a woman nearly her age? Joe returned just after 6, carrying takeout containers from Ridgefield's best Italian restaurant. I figured you wouldn't feel like cooking, she said, with her characteristic bluntness. And neither did I. How are you holding up? Over pasta that I could barely taste despite its quality, I told her about my conversation with Curtis and Haley's text. Joe's expression darkened when I mentioned Curtis's suspicion about Haley knowing about the affair. If she knew and didn't tell you, that's unforgivable, Joe declared, refilling my water glass. She's a grown woman, not a child caught between parents. She had a moral obligation to at least warn you. She's always been closer to Warren, I said, not quite defending her, but seeking to understand. And we haven't been as close since she moved to Colorado. That's no excuse. Blood should count for something. Joe had no children of her own, a source of regret she rarely discussed, but which I knew still pained her. Perhaps that made her judgment of Haley harsher than mine could be. After dinner, exhaustion settled over me again, the combined effect of physical injuries, emotional trauma, and pain medication. Joe helped me set up my laptop and phone charger in the guest room, then left me to rest. I should have worked on the documentation Regina had requested, cataloging my contributions to my marriage and Warren's career. Instead, I found myself opening old photo albums I'd digitized years earlier. There we were on our wedding day, Warren handsome in his rented tuxedo, me radiant in my mother's restored wedding gown. Both of us so young, so certain of our path together. There were photos of the tiny apartment we'd shared while he finished his master's degree and I started my landscaping business. Of the day we closed on our first house, of Warren holding newborn Haley with an expression of terrified wonder, of Curtis's first steps captured as he toddled toward Warren's outstretched arms. Decades of birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, holidays. The visual evidence of a life built together, moment by moment, year by year. Had it all been a lie? Or had something true and valuable simply withered without my noticing, like a plant deprived of water and light until only the dried husk remained? I closed the laptop, unable to bear any more memories. Whatever had happened between Warren and me, I needed to focus on the present and the uncertain future stretching before me. My body required healing, my finances needed securing, and my heart, well, that would have to wait. Survival came first. As I drifted toward sleep, I made a mental list of immediate concerns. Confirm the court date for the emergency motions Regina was filing. Retrieve essential items from the house if the court granted permission. Check my own bank account and credit cards to ensure Warren hadn't restricted my access. Begin looking for more permanent accommodations if returning home proved impossible or unbearable. The list should have been overwhelming, but instead, I found it oddly comforting. These were concrete problems with potential solutions, unlike the nebulous grief of a marriage ended without warning. One step at a time, I told myself, as sleep finally claimed me. Just take one step at a time. Morning brought rain again, pattering against the guest room window in a gentle rhythm that belied the chaos of my life. My body felt marginally better, though movement still caused sharp pains in my ribs and shoulder. Joe had left for the shop, leaving a note about breakfast in the refrigerator and instructions to call if I needed anything. I managed a shower, awkwardly keeping my injured arm dry with plastic wrap, and dressed in the clothes Joe had brought from the store. Simple, comfortable items that weren't my usual style, but served the purpose. As I sipped coffee at Joe's kitchen table, my phone rang. Regina Kwan, calling with news. "We've been granted an emergency hearing this afternoon at 2, she said without preamble. Judge Matthews is presiding. She's fair, but no nonsense. I need you at my office by 1 to prepare." "That's fast," I said, surprised by the quick response from the court system, which I'd always imagined moved at a glacial pace. I emphasized the urgent nature of your situation, being denied access to your home and possessions while injured. The timing worked in our favor. Judge Matthews had a cancellation this afternoon. Regina's voice was brisk, professional. Wear something conservative, but not flashy. Appearance shouldn't matter, but it does. I glanced down at the borrowed clothes, simple black pants and a blue sweater. I don't have many options at the moment. Most of my clothes are still at the house. What you're wearing now should be fine. The important thing is that you appear composed and reasonable. Mr. Hargrove's attorney has been notified. I expect they'll attend, possibly with your husband. The thought of seeing Warren in a courtroom, of having our private marital collapse made public in legal proceedings, made my stomach clench. But what choice did I have? He'd made the first aggressive move by changing the locks and attempting to exclude me from our shared home. Now I had to respond or risk losing everything we'd built together over 40 years. "I'll be there at 1, I promised, ending the call. The hours until then stretched before me, empty of purpose. On impulse, I opened my laptop again and created a new document, not the catalog of marital contributions Regina had requested, but something more personal, a letter to my younger self, the bride who'd stood beside Warren 40 years earlier, full of hope and certainty. "Dear Marley," I typed, "I wish I could tell you what's coming. Not to warn you away from Warren. The love you feel is real, and the years ahead will bring much joy alongside the pain, but to prepare you, to help you maintain your independence even within the partnership of marriage." The words flowed easily, surprising me with their lack of bitterness. I advised my younger self to keep her own bank accounts alongside joint ones, to maintain her professional identity even while supporting Warren's career, to nurture friendships outside the marriage, to remember always that she was Marlene Westbrook first, Warren's wife second. By the time I finished, it was nearly noon, and the exercise had left me feeling strangely peaceful. Nothing had changed in my present circumstances. I was still injured, homeless, and facing the dissolution of my marriage. But something had shifted in my perspective. I had survived before Warren, and I would survive after him. The path ahead was unclear, but I had resources beyond him, my skills, my friends, my resilience. I called Joe to let her know about the court hearing. She immediately offered to close the shop early to accompany me, but I declined. This was something I needed to face alone, or at least with only Regina beside me. I ordered a taxi, carefully applied light makeup to cover the worst of the bruising on my face, and steeled myself for the first public battle in what promised to be a lengthy war. The courthouse, like most of Ridgefield's municipal buildings, was a stately colonial structure with white columns and imposing wooden doors. I'd passed it countless times over the years without ever going inside. Now, as the taxi dropped me at the entrance, I took a deep breath and straightened my shoulders despite the pain. Whatever happened in the next few hours, I would face it with dignity. Warren had already taken my home and my security. I wouldn't let him take my self-respect as well. Regina Kwan was waiting for me in the marble-floored lobby of the courthouse, her charcoal gray suit and crisp white blouse a stark contrast to my borrowed clothes. She didn't comment on my appearance, but gave me an approving nod before leading me to a small conference room where we could speak privately before the hearing. Judge Matthews is known for being thorough but efficient, she explained, arranging documents on the table between us. She'll want to hear both sides, but won't tolerate grandstanding or emotional displays. Stick to the facts, answer only what's asked, and let me handle the legal arguments. I nodded, my mouth too dry for speech. The reality of what was happening, that my marriage was ending in a courtroom rather than through private, dignified discussion, was finally sinking in. Your husband and his attorney are already here, Regina continued, glancing at her watch. Bradley Winchester is representing him. He's competent, but predictable, tends to rely heavily on financial arguments rather than personal circumstances. What are our chances? I asked, forcing the words past the tightness in my throat. Regina's expression was carefully neutral. For the emergency motions we've filed? Good. Your situation is textbook for requiring judicial intervention. Denial of access to the marital home, potential financial vulnerability, recent physical injury. For the larger divorce settlement, it's too early to say, but Connecticut law is generally favorable to long-term spouses in your position. Before I could ask more questions, there was a knock at the door, and a court officer informed us that Judge Matthews was ready. Regina gathered her materials with practiced efficiency, and I followed her into the courtroom, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain everyone could hear it. The room was smaller than I'd expected, with dark wood paneling and uncomfortable-looking benches. Warren was already seated at one table, with a silver-haired man I assumed was Bradley Winchester. He didn't turn as I entered, his back rigid and unfamiliar in an expensive suit I hadn't seen before. Judge Matthews, a woman perhaps a decade younger than me with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes, called the court to order. The proceedings moved quickly after that, with Regina presenting our emergency motions and the circumstances that necessitated them. She emphasized my injuries, the length of our marriage, and the shocking manner in which I'd been denied access to my home. When Bradley Winchester rose to respond, his argument focused on Warren's substantial financial contributions to the marriage and his client's generous offer to provide temporary support while divorce proceedings progressed. Your Honor, Winchester said smoothly, Mr. Hargrove has every intention of providing appropriate financial support to Mrs. Westbrook. He simply felt that a clean separation was in everyone's best interests, given the deterioration of the marital relationship over recent years. Judge Matthews's expression remained impassive. Mr. Winchester, I'm less concerned with your client's intentions than with his actions. Changing the locks on the marital home while his wife of 40 years was away, regardless of the state of their relationship, was inappropriate at best and potentially illegal at worst. Winchester attempted to interject, but Judge Matthews raised a hand to silence him. I've heard enough. I'm granting the emergency motion for temporary spousal support in the amount of $5,000 per month, effective immediately. As for the marital residence, she paused, reviewing the documents before her, then continued. I'm ordering that Mrs. Westbrook be granted exclusive possession of the marital home for a period of 60 days, during which time Mr. Hargrove will need to find alternative accommodation. This will give Mrs. Westbrook time to recover from her injuries in familiar surroundings and to make arrangements for more permanent housing if desired. I felt a surge of vindication, quickly followed by uncertainty. Return to the house where Warren and Tiffany had been living? The thought was both appealing and disturbing. It was my home, the place I'd lovingly maintained for decades, but it would also hold fresh memories of betrayal now. Judge Matthews wasn't finished. Additionally, I'm issuing a temporary restraining order preventing either party from disposing of or transferring any marital assets exceeding $5,000 in value without written agreement from both parties or further court order. Mr. Hargrove will provide Mrs. Westbrook's attorney with a complete accounting of all marital assets within 7 days. She looked directly at Warren for the first time. Mr. Hargrove, while I understand that marriages end for many reasons, the manner in which you've chosen to end yours shows a disturbing lack of respect for your wife's dignity and legal rights. I strongly suggest you approach the remainder of these proceedings with greater consideration." Warren's face remained expressionless, but I saw his jaw tighten, a familiar sign of suppressed anger that I'd learned to recognize over 40 years of marriage. With a few final instructions about filing deadlines for the formal divorce proceedings, Judge Matthews adjourned the hearing. Regina gathered her materials, a small smile of satisfaction playing at the corners of her mouth. "A good start," she murmured as we prepared to leave. "The judge clearly didn't appreciate your husband's tactics." I nodded, but my attention was on Warren, who was having an intense, whispered conversation with his attorney. Would he acknowledge me? Apologize for locking me out? Offer some explanation beyond the vague complaints he'd given on the porch? He did none of those things. After finishing with Winchester, Warren stood, straightened his tie, and walked toward the exit without once glancing in my direction. The deliberate snub hurt more than I wanted to admit. "When can I return to the house?" I asked Regina, watching Warren's retreating back. "The court order takes effect immediately. I'd suggest tomorrow morning. That gives your husband time to pack some essentials and make arrangements." She gave me an assessing look. "Would you like me to accompany you? Or perhaps have a friend there?" The thought of facing Warren and possibly Tiffany alone was daunting, but I nodded. "Joe will come with me. And maybe my son. He's arriving Saturday." "Good. Document everything when you return. Any damage, missing items, changes to the property. Take photographs. And call me immediately if there are any problems with your husband vacating as ordered." Regina's tone was matter-of-fact, but her expression held genuine concern. "This is just the beginning, Mrs. Westbrook. Prepare yourself for a potentially lengthy process." As I left the courthouse, I felt oddly hollow. I'd won this initial skirmish, secured temporary financial support, regained access to my home. But the victory brought little satisfaction. 40 years reduced to legal arguments and court orders, love and shared history replaced by attorneys and judges. Was this really what Warren wanted? What either of us deserved? Jo was waiting at her house when I returned, eager for news of the hearing. Her outrage at Warren's behavior had not diminished with time. If anything, it had intensified as she'd had more opportunity to reflect on what she termed his despicable treatment of me. "So you get the house back? That's fantastic," she exclaimed when I related Judge Matthews's ruling. "When can we go get your things?" "Tomorrow morning." Regina suggested giving Warren time to pack and make arrangements to leave. I sank onto Joe's sofa, suddenly exhausted despite the relatively short court appearance. "I'm not sure how I feel about going back there, Joe. It's my home, but now it's also the place where he betrayed me, where he brought another woman." Joe's expression softened from righteous anger to sympathy. "I understand. After Thomas left, I couldn't bear to sleep in our bedroom for months. Ended up on the couch most nights." She sat beside me, taking my hand. "But it's still your house, Marley, your garden, your life. Don't let what Warren did take that from you, too." That night, I slept fitfully, my dreams a confused jumble of courtrooms and empty houses. I woke early, anxiety about the coming confrontation making further rest impossible. Jo had already prepared coffee and a light breakfast, her usual brisk efficiency tempered with gentle concern. "Howard called," she said, referring to her neighbor, Howard Tanner, a widower who occasionally helped with heavy lifting at her shop. "He's offered to come with us to help move anything you need." I shook my head. "Not today. I just want to assess the situation first, see what condition the house is in. Maybe after Curtis arrives on Saturday, we can move some of the heavier items if needed." Jo nodded, not pushing the issue. She understood my need to reclaim my space gradually, to adjust to the new reality of my life one step at a time. As we drove toward what had been my home for 3 decades, I tried to prepare myself for what we might find. Would Warren be belligerent, challenging the court order? Would Tiffany be there, her presence a deliberate reminder of what had replaced me? Or would the house be empty, Warren having retreated without further confrontation? The last scenario proved correct. When we pulled into the driveway, Warren's Mustang was gone, as was the silver Audi that had been parked there during my previous visit. The house looked exactly as it always had from the outside. The maple trees I'd planted swaying gently in the autumn breeze. The garden showing signs of neglect, but still beautiful in its fall colors. Jo reached over and squeezed my hand. "Ready?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We approached the front door, and with trembling fingers, I tried my old key. To my surprise, it worked. Warren or someone had changed the locks back to the original. Stepping inside felt surreal. The foyer was exactly as I remembered it, with the antique hall table I'd restored and the landscape paintings I'd selected. But as we moved deeper into the house, subtle differences became apparent. Warren's favorite leather recliner was missing from the living room. The wall of family photographs had been disturbed, with several frames now absent. I noted with a pang that most of the missing photos were of Warren with the children, leaving behind primarily those featuring me or the kids alone. The kitchen showed signs of recent occupancy, a coffee mug in the sink, a faint lingering scent of unfamiliar perfume. I opened the refrigerator to find it nearly empty, except for condiments and a half-empty bottle of white wine I didn't recognize. Warren preferred red. He cleared out quickly, Joe observed, opening cabinets to assess what remained. Took his clothes, personal items, some electronics from what I can see. I nodded, continuing my silent inventory of the house. Our bedroom, my bedroom now, showed the most dramatic changes. Warren's closet was empty, the drawers that had held his clothes now bare. The king-sized bed we'd shared for decades had been stripped of linens, the mattress bare. On Warren's nightstand, where he'd kept reading glasses, a water carafe, and usually a history book or biography, there was now only dust outlines showing where objects had been. My side of the room remained untouched, my books still stacked on the nightstand, my reading lamp positioned just as I'd left it before my trip to Haley's. The effect was eerie, as if half a life had been erased while the other half remained frozen in time. "We should document everything," I said, remembering Regina's advice. "Take photos of what's missing, what's been changed." Joe nodded, pulling out her phone to begin photographing the rooms. I continued my inspection, noting with relief that most of the furniture and artwork remained. Warren had apparently taken only his personal possessions and a few items with particular sentimental value to him. In my home office, I found a sealed envelope on the desk with my name written in Warren's familiar handwriting. With Joe photographing the kitchen, I had a moment of privacy to open it. Marley, I've complied with the court order and vacated the house. I've taken only my personal effects and a few items of furniture that were mine before our marriage or gifts specifically to me. A detailed list is attached. I never intended for things to end this way. The locks were changed as a temporary measure while I sorted out arrangements, not as a permanent exclusion. Your injury was unfortunate timing. My lawyer will be in contact regarding the divorce proceedings. I hope we can handle this amicably despite the adversarial start. Warren. No apology, no real explanation. Just cool, detached statements that felt more like communication between business associates than people who had shared a life for 4 decades. I folded the letter and slipped it into my pocket, unsure whether to show it to Regina or simply file it away as another piece of evidence that the Warren I'd known, or thought I'd known, was gone. By the time Joe and I finished our inventory of the house, it was early afternoon. The process had been emotionally draining but necessary. I now had a clear picture of what remained and what I would need to replace or manage without. More importantly, I had reclaimed my physical space, the first step in rebuilding my life. "What now?" Joe asked, as we sat at the kitchen table, the familiar surroundings a stark contrast to the unfamiliar situation. "I need to get some groceries, basic supplies, and linens for the bed." I glanced around, mentally cataloging the immediate necessities. Then I suppose I start living here again. Alone. The word hung in the air between us. Alone. After 40 years of marriage, of shared spaces and daily routines built around another person's presence, I was alone. The house suddenly felt too large, too quiet, despite Joe's companionship. "You don't have to stay here tonight if you're not ready," Joe said gently. "The guest room is yours for as long as you need it." I shook my head. "I need to do this, Joe. The longer I wait, the harder it will be." I attempted a smile that felt wooden on my face. "Besides, Curtis will be here Saturday. I should have the house ready for him." Joe didn't argue, but her expression remained concerned as we made a shopping list and planned the rest of the day. We drove to the local department store for new bedding. I couldn't bear the thought of sleeping on sheets Warren might have shared with Tiffany, and then to the grocery store for essentials. The mundane activities helped ground me, providing a sense of normalcy amidst the chaos of my life. By evening, the house had begun to feel like mine again, or at least a version of it that could become mine. I'd replaced the missing items with temporary solutions: a throw pillow where Warren's framed engineering award had stood, a potted plant in the corner where his recliner had been. Small changes that helped me reclaim the space. Jo stayed until after dinner, helping me arrange the new bedding and stock the kitchen. When she finally prepared to leave, I felt a flash of panic at the thought of spending the night alone in the house that had witnessed the collapse of my marriage. "Call me if you need anything," Jo said, hugging me carefully to avoid jostling my injured shoulder. "Anything at all, any time of night." "Promise?" I promised, then stood in the doorway watching her drive away, fighting the impulse to call her back or follow her to the safety of her guest room. This was my home. I had fought for it in court and won the right to be here. I wouldn't let fear or painful memories drive me away. That first night alone was strange in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just Warren's absence. We'd been apart before during his business trips or my occasional conferences and garden tours. It was the finality of it, the knowledge that this was not a temporary separation, but the beginning of a permanent new reality. I moved through my evening routine mechanically. A light dinner, medication for my still healing injuries, a shower in the bathroom that now held only my products on the counter. I avoided looking at the empty spaces where Warren's things had been, focusing instead on the familiar elements that remained: my gardening magazines, my collection of ceramics, the watercolor landscapes I'd selected during our trip to Provence for our 30th anniversary. Sleep eluded me despite my physical and emotional exhaustion. I lay awake in the center of the king-sized bed, the empty space beside me a tangible reminder of all I had lost. Around 2 a.m, I finally gave up, wrapped myself in a robe, and wandered downstairs to the sunroom that overlooked the garden. The night was clear, the autumn moon casting silver light across the flower beds and shrubs I'd tended for decades. I sat in darkness, watching the play of moonlight and shadows, and allowed myself to weep for the first time since the initial shock of Warren's betrayal. Not the violent sobs that had racked my injured ribs in the hotel room, but quiet tears of mourning for the life I'd thought I had, the future I'd expected, the love I'd believed in. Dawn found me still in the sunroom, dried tears on my cheeks, but a strange calm settling over me. As the first light touched my garden, illuminating the late-blooming asters and sedum I'd planted, I realized that while Warren had taken much from me, he hadn't taken everything. This house, this garden, my professional skills and reputation, my friendships, these remained. And perhaps most importantly, I remained. In the growing light, I made a decision. I would not define my future solely in terms of what I had lost. This house would be my sanctuary, not just a battlefield won in legal proceedings. The garden would continue to bloom under my care, its cycles of growth and renewal, a reminder that life persisted even after devastating loss. By the time the sun had fully risen, I had made coffee and begun a list, not of missing items or legal questions, but of changes I wanted to make to the house. The guest room Warren had used as a home office would become a true studio for my landscape design work. The formal dining room we'd used only for occasional dinner parties would be repurposed as a comfortable reading nook. The master bathroom Warren had always dominated with his preference for stark, utilitarian spaces would be redesigned with the soft colors and natural elements I'd always favored. Small acts of reclamation, of asserting my presence and preferences in spaces that had been compromised. Not erasing Warren, our shared history remained in the foundation of the house and my life, but building something new atop that foundation, something that reflected who I was now and who I might become. Curtis called mid-morning to confirm his arrival time for Saturday, his voice carrying the protective concern of a son who had suddenly found his family structure upended. I reassured him that I was managing, that the court hearing had gone well, that I was back in the house and beginning to adjust. I didn't mention my sleepless night or moments of overwhelming grief. He would see enough of my vulnerability when he arrived. No need to burden him further from a distance. "Have you heard from Haley?" he asked cautiously. "No. I texted her, but she hasn't called." The hurt of my daughter's silence was a constant ache beneath the more immediate pain of Warren's betrayal. Curtis's sigh carried through the phone. She's in a difficult position, Mom. She and Dad have always been close, and she's trying to process everything too. I bit back the response that sprang to mind, that, as the abandoned spouse recovering from physical injuries, perhaps my need for support outweighed my daughter's processing difficulties. Instead, I simply acknowledged his point and changed the subject to his travel plans. After we hung up, I returned to my list of home modifications, but my concentration was broken. Haley's continued silence weighed heavily on me. Was Curtis right about her simply needing time, or had she truly chosen sides, aligning herself with Warren despite his cruel treatment of me? And if so, what did that mean for our relationship moving forward? Questions without immediate answers, problems without easy solutions. Like so much in this new phase of my life, they would require patience, resilience, and a willingness to navigate uncertain terrain. But as I looked out at my garden, at the sturdy perennials that had weathered countless seasons of harsh winters and destructive storms only to return stronger each spring, I found a measure of hope. I too could weather this season of loss and emerge, perhaps not unchanged, but still capable of growth and renewal. With that thought sustaining me, I turned my attention to preparing for Curtis's visit. My son was coming home, not to the intact family he'd always known, but to a mother determined to build something meaningful from the wreckage of her marriage. It wasn't the legacy I'd planned to leave my children, but perhaps it could still be one of strength and dignity rather than bitterness and defeat. Curtis arrived early Saturday morning with determined energy and a rental car full of groceries. The moment he walked through the door and wrapped me in a careful hug, mindful of my injuries, something inside me settled. Having my son here made the house feel like home again, even if our family was irrevocably changed. "You look better than I expected," he said, studying my face. The bruises had begun to fade to yellowish green, and I'd regained some of my color after those first shocking days. "I'm tougher than I look," I replied, managing a genuine smile. We spent the morning making the house truly mine again. Curtis helped move furniture, creating the reading nook I'd envisioned in the former dining room and rearranging the bedroom to eliminate the empty spaces Warren had left. Physical changes to mirror the emotional transformation I was undergoing. Around noon, the doorbell rang. Curtis answered while I was arranging books on a newly positioned shelf. His voice, tight with surprise and tension, drew me to the foyer. Haley stood in the doorway, her posture rigid and defensive. She looked so much like Warren in that moment, the same set of her jaw, the same analytical gaze assessing the situation. "Mom," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I thought we should talk in person." I nodded, unable to find words past the sudden tightness in my throat. My daughter was here. Despite everything, she had come. We moved to the kitchen, the heart of our home where so many family discussions had taken place over the years. Curtis made coffee, the routine task giving us all a moment to gather ourselves. When we were seated around the table, me across from Haley, Curtis between us like a mediator, the silence stretched uncomfortably. "Dad told me his version," Haley finally said. "I'd like to hear yours." Calmly, without accusation or drama, I recounted the events: the bus crash, my injuries, the locked door, Warren's dismissal of 40 years together. Haley listened without interruption, her expression revealing nothing. "Did you know?" I asked when I'd finished. "About Tiffany, before it happened." Haley looked down at her coffee, then met my eyes directly. I knew he was unhappy. He told me he was considering leaving several months ago. "I told him to talk to you first, to try counseling." A pause. I didn't know about her specifically until after he'd changed the locks. The admission hurt, but also brought relief. My daughter hadn't completely betrayed me, even if she hadn't warned me either. "I'm not taking sides," Haley continued. "You're both my parents. What's happened between you is," she struggled for words, "tragic, but I won't cut either of you from my life." It wasn't the unconditional support I'd secretly hoped for, but it was honest. Haley had always been pragmatic, uncomfortable with emotional messiness. Her presence here, her willingness to maintain relationship with both Warren and me, was its own form of love. The conversation shifted to practical matters, the ongoing legal proceedings, my plans for the house, my recovery. By evening, the worst of the tension had eased. We wouldn't resolve everything in one day, but we'd begun the process of defining our new family reality. Sunday morning brought unexpected visitors. Joe arrived with Howard Tanner, the widowed neighbor who'd offered help moving furniture. But they weren't alone. Vincent Abernathy, a former client for whom I'd designed an award-winning corporate garden, stood on my porch with a portfolio under his arm. "I heard about your situation," he said after Curtis invited them in. "Professional circles, you know. Word travels." I nodded, unsurprised. Ridgefield was small enough that news, especially scandalous news, spread quickly. "The Botanical Garden in Hartford is planning a major redesign of their native plants section," Vincent continued. "I immediately thought of you. Your work with indigenous species has always been exceptional." He opened the portfolio, revealing preliminary concepts for an ambitious project. "They need a lead designer, someone with vision and extensive knowledge of northeastern flora, someone like you." I stared at the plans, excitement stirring beneath my caution. This was a prestigious project, exactly the kind of work I'd loved before scaling back my business to accommodate Warren's career and our family needs. "It's a 2-year commitment," Vincent added, "good compensation, and a chance to create something lasting, something entirely yours, something entirely mine." The phrase echoed in my mind as I examined the portfolio more closely. Here was opportunity arising from loss, a door opening as another closed. "I'd need to see the space, discuss parameters with the board," I said, professional instincts awakening. "And my shoulder will need another month of healing before I can do field work." Vincent smiled. "They're prepared to wait for the right designer. Think about it." Later, after everyone had gone and the house was quiet again, I sat in my garden as twilight descended. 6 weeks ago, my life had seemed settled, my future predictable. Now everything had changed. My marriage was ending. My relationship with my children was evolving. My professional identity was reawakening. The bus crash that had seemed so devastating had actually set me on a path to rediscovery. Without it, I might have continued in my comfortable but increasingly hollow marriage, never knowing Warren's true feelings, never having the opportunity to redefine myself on my own terms. Pain had broken me open, but in that breaking, new growth had found space to emerge. Like the perennials in my garden after a harsh winter, I was pushing through difficult soil toward light and renewal. The journey ahead would not be easy, but I was no longer afraid of it. As darkness fell completely, I made a silent promise to myself. I would not merely survive this upheaval, I would transform through it. At 63, my life wasn't ending with my marriage. It was beginning again on my own terms, shaped by my own hands. If you've ever faced a moment where everything you thought was certain suddenly falls apart, know that you're not alone. I never expected to start over at my age, but here I am, finding strength I never knew I had. Subscribe to hear more of my journey as I navigate this new chapter. Next week, I'll take you with me to the Hartford Botanical Gardens as I begin the biggest project of my career.